Hello, everypony. It's Lotus Moon. Well, this reading today is going to be a bit different. I wasn't expecting it to be this way, and, well, pretty much from the title, you can guess that it's not a typical reading. I mean, of course, not all readings are pretty typical and everything, but this reading in particular is.
Aren't you forgetting something, little dearie? You haven't introduced me yet.
You're right. I'm sorry about that. But you better promise to be on your best behavior for this.
Oh, I will. How does that ridiculous thing go? Cross my heart and hope to fly, stick a cupcake in my eye, or something like that. Anyway, yes, I promise I'll behave, as long as you promise not to lock me up again.
Lily, you just made a pinky promise. And if you don't keep it, that pink erratic ball of fluff will rain down all kinds of hell on us. And I really don't want that to happen.
Whatever she does to me doesn't pale in comparison to what I could possibly do to her. Anyway, everybody, I'm back. Did you miss me? I certainly missed you. As Lotus clumsily said, this reading isn't your typical reading. It's an anthology, and since I'm here, I'll have a part in this too.
Lily, that was my line. I'll get you back for that. But it's not like every pony didn't know this was an anthology reading since it is in the title. Anyway, every pony, this reading is called Missing Pages and Scrawled Footnotes, and it was written by Iceverse. Please enjoy. Equinity. Poems. Truth. All is rotting. All is crumbling. Do you feel trembling? All has fallen. The light is out. The pariah lives on. When you look, why do you choose down upon ponies where you see nothing but the dirt where you have fallen? Yet you have the nerve to ask why I look above where I can see all alone together with the stars. Over and over, a mortal is born. Again and again, a mortal has died. Time after time, for all of them, such standard response, nearly automatic. Yet, in your name, how many tears have I dried? A single name, stricken from history, a dusty antique of a memory in my heart's attic. Lies. Composed, she dons her mask. Expendable is her own welfare, losing a battle within herself, expectations of any return smashed, smiling forever after, trying to fill the emptiness, in denial as always, abhorred by her own actions, cannot bear to tell any truth, acknowledge it even, no longer believes in the harmony that she preaches, can't bear to remember any longer, hollow beneath her costume, altering conventions little by little in her forgotten name, never wanted to hurt her sister so, grooms each faithful student for a single empty purpose, even though it is only to reassure herself. Just weep. Poetry. Like clockwork, awaken, rise from the dirt, fallen star. Alone in the sky that is your world, except for one. Brush the vibrant pink veil aside, so you might see her lying there, form softened with slumber, white hooves caked with the world's broken flesh. Hide your coveted status, real within, and what you've become, sleeping no longer, in the dirt, reach out for your blue companion and wake her as well. She is not as scared as you. Smile upon her and bestow this light in the dark that you fear. Her face is smudged with dust that cakes her quilts. Little child, as bright and alone as ever. She reaches into the bags next to her, pulling a brush from the tattered brown fabric, buckle dulled with mud. You do not tell her your fear. Little voices whispering in the depths of you. You smile shakily, having yet to master perfect composure, and in the dark you count the strokes the brush makes in pale blue, that always finds a way to shine true. Unlike little child, princess no longer, unlike you build your mask with care, with whatever you can gather from the world that you feel is hollow of all but dirt. Your smile is as dazzling as the sun that hides in the night that you alone fear, and upon your head, as if marking your troubled mind, is dirt caked in the shape of the sun. Little child, unmarked and forsaken, lie no longer to yourself, just weep.
Twitch. Original music.
Swallow, blink, a deep breath, the loudest sound she'll make all day, the one that will never be heard, well, only by her with the midnight coat. Every day continues. Nothing looks wrong to the average pony, and why would it? They aren't very observant to begin with. Celestia, with her bright white coat and harsh radiance, chatters among them as if she could lower herself to their level and call herself a pony. No longer content with what she is, she tries to forget, and Luna tries to talk. It's simple, right? Think of what to say. Open her mouth. Speak. Only it wasn't simple. Don't talk became can't talk. Her mind swarmed with details of the everyday, all the little sorrows and joys that bathed in the air around her. Everything sparkled like glass, so obvious. Unlike her, noticeable. Every day was brighter. Each night shunned even more. Each star a curse. Mouth open. That was Celestia. Talking, smiling, welcoming, whatever they wanted her to be. She was the sun, and she burned. It wasn't that Luna didn't know what to say as hallways passed her eyes and other ponies passed her like a ghost, or maybe more like furniture, present but unimportant. What need was there to pay any attention to her? She knew exactly what she wanted to say. Always. When she had spoken well. But she knew everything that had to be said. Each syllable that would sound like thunder to her own ears, even if it were but a whisper. That is what made it difficult. She could see the road before her. Going in blind would be far easier. She sits next to Celestia on a forgotten throne, half the room of stone. Sharp angles and dull hues in a neat tomb, imperial beyond belief, majestic and properly suffocating, was gold. Sun gold. She blinked in pain. Yellow flowers knew to keep soft. These banners bled. Her gaze dropped. Each crack on the floor swam in front of her. Each speck of dust made itself noticeable. Luna drew a deep breath, just quiet enough not to come across as bored. The noble droned on, ill-chosen words falling from his lips and cluttering the air with their meaninglessness. Each utterance was hollow. Luna's mind dipped beyond noise, her face a comforting stoic look. She was surrounded by ponies. Alone. Alone was but a different way to spell peace for this dark mare. She shifted quietly in her seat, 4 hooves quietly in front of her, slouching slightly. Her mind screamed as she watched the mouth of the noble move. Each of his words was wasted, wasted, wasted. Celestia complimented his presentation, a mask of seriousness overtaking her pursed lips smile, before she allowed it to widen again. Luna was to cut the strings her sister was burrowing into herself. Blue eyes went unnoticed as they watched the next noble entered, a cacophony and chinks of ill-spent phrases and practiced greetings dropping to the ground before he even entered the room. The walls echoed with their worthlessness. Luna's stare widened. She completely forgotten now, eyes boring into Celestia. She does not hide their horror, raw and tearing. Celestia gives a kindly smile, veils of subject-centric thoughts narrowing her vision as she is unaware of her shadow's distress, misery, panic. After all, is it not the princess, pretty, loved, popular, following the cues to make sacrifices? Luna watches as her sister bravely sacrifices the good of one for the mewling, silk-clad idiot's attention before her. 1 over many is the sun's way. Speak, 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 roars the thunder in her mind. Her vision swims. Every detail stands out, screaming and bright. The glitter of her sister's crown, the lace of her gown, the ever-free palace sparkles with the recent cleaning it has in honor of the new day. Slowly, Luna tears her gaze away from her sister. The far wall becomes her focus. Her heart is steady, and this is every day, and she tries to only listen to that. It doesn't work. All the sounds and stray vowels that drift through the air finds her ears. Luna almost blinks. To her, it feels like a slow movement, but she knows it's far quicker. A faint tick, a twitch that passes the notice of others. Not a dream. She can't tap Celestia to catch her attention. They had made a silent treaty signed with bitterness, stubborn will, and everything between them. Luna still remembers the sound of the screams in their last fight that tore at the mere scraps their relationship had been in then. Sisters in name only. Celestia ruled, and Luna's jaw twitches. 1 minute is over. Swallow, blink. There's still many more to come. Crumby Day. A one-shot fluff. Shining Armor hurried down the empty streets of Canterlot. His school saddlebag thumped against his sides, and Sweet began to bead under his forelock. He had to get home first. His hoofs clacked loudly on the stone streets as he galloped at full speed. Heart thumping wildly, he reluctantly slowed down to fix a dangling buckle on his school bag. Spilled homework would mean he would be delayed, and if he was delayed, that means disaster would strike. His little sister would get all the cookies. Not only would they be scrumptious chocolate chip cookies, but they would be fresh, and that meant gooey, moist chips and just the right amount of soft and chewiness for the cookie part as well. Aside from that tempting factor, Shining couldn't let himself be bested by a 9-year-old. After turning a few streets, he came to a medium-sized 2-floor house. It wasn't a super extravagant abode like some of the mansions in other sections of Canterlot, but it was home. With its purple curtains, toy-filled backyard, and the occasional book fort. He rummaged through his bag, magically pulling out his copy of the house key, and turned it in the lock. Once Shining Armor stepped inside, he snuck into the kitchen and found the mutilated white remains of an advanced equestrian cultures test scattered about the floor's surface. On the counter was a plate of cookies that remained untouched. Under the plate was a note from their mom explaining how she and Nightlight, Shining Armor and Twilight Sparkle's father, would be home late, so she made them extra chocolatey cookies as long as they were in bed by 9 p.m. But none of this was important to Shining. Who cares about chocolatey cookies? His sister had gotten home first and was nowhere to be seen. His socially awkward, super smart sister. Even more mysterious was, why was there an exam that could only be Twily's lying ripped up on the floor? Twilight wouldn't rip up a school paper, would she? He decided to go check upstairs to see what was wrong, but not before he shoved some cookies in his mouth. When he climbed up the stairs, Shining found a trail of papers, books, pencils, and even a Philly-sized school bag flung all around the stairwell. The trail led up to Twily's room, the door ajar. "Twily, are you alright?" No response. What if something had... No, Shining Armor thought. Maybe she's just napping. Or she slipped. I'm gonna go in there and see what's wrong. I'm a responsible 13-year-old colt. I know CPR, and I can find some of the princess's guards if something bad really did happen. He stepped into her room. Everything looked normal. Her bed was made, her toy chest was open, and her bookshelf was empty. The book fort reinforced with blankets in the middle of the room, however, was sobbing. Twily? Silence, then a faint BBBFF. Her voice sounded meek and scared, and it was at the whiny, pitiable stage of the crying process where you just want to burst into tears as well from hearing it and give the sobber more hugs than there are rays on the princess's son. Twily, are you hurt? More sobs. Only my pride. Can I come in the fort? Okay. Something was definitely wrong, he thought. She didn't even ask for the password, which she normally harasses me for. Shining Armor crawled inside, wiggling around the ballistae built out of books before magically lifting the blanket fraction of the roof off so he could sit up. This allowed more light to enter the book fort, revealing a small Twilight with a mussed mane, tear-stained face buried in her hoofs, and smarty pants clutched in her foreleg. She didn't look up. Shining gulped. He'd never seen his sister act quite like this before. Come on, Twily, he prompted. Tell me what's wrong. I'm getting sent to a public academy. It's a magic kindergarten. And I can't be Princess Celestia's student anymore. What? Who told you this? More sobs. You know, Magic Kindergarten isn't so bad. The teachers are really nice and they never had bad juice boxes. Plus, I'm sure you'll still get to eat a ton of graham crackers during snack time. Even though she couldn't see him, Shining Armor forced an awkward, it will be okay smile. Twilight, come on, you love graham crackers. LOVE them. Remember that story we wrote? Where you married a graham cracker monster? I still have it somewhere in my room. I'll read it to you until you die of laughter. Twilight buried her head further into her hoofs. If Magic Kindergarten is so great, why are you in military school? She huffed cynically. You know that answer. I want to be a soldier. Now, if you tell me what is really wrong, I'll let you dress me like a princess again, and we can play attack on the book fort. I learned more about architecture today, so we can give your book fort buttresses. Won't that be nice? No. Oh, come on. Don't be a party pooper. I'm sure it wasn't that bad. If you help me clean up the stairwell and kitchen, we can have a sleepover in my room. I'll let you have the top bunk, and you can eat as many cookies as you want, even if you become sick. I'll take the blame, I promise. Please just tell me what's wrong. She muttered something into Smarty Pants. Twilight, could you speak a little louder? I said I got a bad grade on my super duper hard chartist language and history exam. Twilight, I bet it was only a C, okay? They aren't too bad. I got them when I was your age. It just means you need to study better for next time. One letter won't determine your life. It wasn't a C. She didn't lift her head. Is this fuss all over a B? You've gotten plenty of B's before. It was an F. I won't be able to do a makeup project either. Now I see why you're so sad. What did Princess Celestia say? She said she'll help me make a study sheet, then we'll make some flashcards just for the basic history stuff. Well, that isn't too bad, said Shining Armor, laughing lightly. Although, I doubt you'll ever have to go to Trotland. Twilight Sparkle lifted her head, sat up and clutched Smarty Pants close. Tears were dried on her face. Shiny? Yes? Can I have a cookie? Yeah, let me bring the plate up. He got up and went to the door. Shiny? Shining Armor paused in the doorway and turned around. What is it? Do I still get to dress you up like a princess? He sighed. I don't see why not. I did promise you after all. Twilight stuck out her tongue and smiled. Everything begins. Poetry. Discord and Celestia. Both could agree that for at least 1,000 years of parallel eternity, each had been frozen in place. Her with a smile upon her face and a name removed without a trace. He felt the paralyzing cage of stone which had changed his flesh and corrupted his bone. The princess who let her crown speak for her, and the being who could no longer feel the wind stir. They had been friends in another time, and for her what felt like another life, where her mind had yet to go under her own knife. Parted and driven apart like nothing one day, he felt like he needed to be dust in the wind, taste of freedom that wouldn't allow him to stay. Inside the filly, who had already lost so much, her heart crashed and burned. But she hid it all behind the perfect smile she had learned. He traveled the world doing whatever he wanted, while the sun traveled north, seeking the land where she remained haunted. For many years, they only diverged with the aid of the distance between them. His name she did condemn. He who wandered to the south became a famed menace through the word of mouth. She to the bitter north brought so many bottled emotions forth. A roaring fire she became, warming those far away and burning those closest to her, locking her in a tragic dance with her own shadow, the bright blue creature having no more sisterhood to bestow. And there was silence. To the land south she guides ponies to a land free of shroud of snow. Her royal birthright she seeks to reclaim, and he who travels north seeks entertainment bought by anarchy and fame. Face to face, after so long, the tyrant meets the puppet master. With her stringed shadow and his lost friendship, they forge their own disaster. Their own names, but insults on the other's tongue. Gone and forgotten are the days when they were young. After their first spat, the tyrant, thirsting for her taken kingdom, drags her shadow away with threats of return. Carefree and mad, the usurper finds the two goddesses to be no concern. With ancient gems that aren't what they seem, the dying sisterhood unites temporarily to bring back the elders' regime. Their former friend, their elements petrify, as if no more were needed to make their bond die. 50 years later, and it's 1,000 years ago, did their truly lone son have tears that did overflow. And while she realized that none but her were to blame, part of her refused to acknowledge that in her mind of absolutes, she may have been the villain all along. She tries to learn of her sister's plight with a daring and dangerous flight, to scream tabula rasa at the skies, crying for her hollow feelings, heart, and mechanical mind to be made truly blank, to forget grief and feeling, to be the perfect princess and rule on. For this destruction of herself, she would not see herself as the tyrant a moment longer, a foul monster, withing and disgusting and rank. Century after century, she rules alone, smiling almost all day, as if neat and clockwork driven, until one day she confronts a forgotten statue and asks if she can be forgiven. She cannot hear his words as he hears hers, and only wants her to accept his entropy and give in. A miscommunication and half forgiveness with a plea to change his ways. And a few decades later, her faithful student and nation of Equestria, he tried to raise. She couldn't bear to witness what felt like only a tyrant's crime, and so he found his seal to be broken in such short time. And there the princess waited to see if he'd adopt the trend, waiting and waiting in her castle, only to hear the confirmation that he had made a friend. From there, they tried to build the friendship that was lost, only for her to be hurt once more as Equestria's flag from his mismatched claws was tossed. So he could follow a different tyrant, and even though the situation seemed so dour, she found herself forgiving him again, this time for a flower. That was a leap from friendship, a silent shove, and her nod a confirmation of mutual love.
Click. Sombra and Una. Bonus material.
Click. A resounding sound, faint and deceptive to those whose ears listen too hard or not at all. Brief and dull to those creatures who pound the ground as they walk but ignore the world's whispers of the coming silence before the players move once more across their vast stage, murmuring their dialogue so much a small echo goes unnoticed despite the weight it carries. Click. The sound of something momentous and often forgotten. The equestrian tongues call it Eureka when they have but a shadow of these, while immortal ears prick up in hopes of catching a fleeting hint of what is to come, provided they can hope to decipher the fragment. There was no drastic variation to what was in the moment. It was the actions of those who brought about such events and the aftermaths that they forged that new set of things in motion. Few had this occur in their life. For while they could acknowledge themselves as heroes in their own modest stories, the truth was not far more. The truth was they were far from even that, being bystanders at most, for their paths were plain as they were. Yet there were those pony gods, or something else entirely, who call the shots and obey no worldly script, but saw fit to unravel whatever puppet strings that those who only appeared to be their peers held onto in hope of being guided to endings they gave little thought to, for they did not defy, and their dreams were not made into something greater. They were not last. They would cease to transcend if they tried at all. Each and every one of them would fail and continue to work out their small dreams and uncomplicated lives to which there was no remedy until one day fate's usually absent strings snagged them upwards with a necklace of rope, and it would be there some amiable seeming reaper would collect them like flowers. But they wayward burned and thrashed, refusing to cease even when they lacked any common restraints that would be the accepted burden to their placid kin. Those who fought nothing gained nothing. Those who sought nothing learned nothing. Those who dreamed forever created nothing, and those who toiled forever dual-wielded unnecessary humility alongside some other tools in hopes of creating something to represent themselves, often never looking to see what they were beyond the coat of a pony and feathers of a griffin. Sombra was none of the above. He was neither bound by common order or a pony. He was the most wayward of all mortals. And now he resided in what could have been nothing. Could have been if he ignored the ever-present everything which had sprung from him in the first moments of what would be 1,000 years as he sensed the cold that no normal mortal could hope to survive, and that would even cause the gods to shiver, if they could in such a situation. Sombra's own presence would grow to fill this, or at least most of the vast void that could rob almost every aspect of being and their mind from every sane soul that would face the same impossibly long stay that would no doubt last longer than any mortal life. Luckily, Sombra was one who had never known sanity. This was a place where Sombra would never feel snow beneath his bare hooves, for there was no snow to fall, no sky for it to fall from, and no ground for it to fall upon. Sombra also noted that he had no hooves as well. His body was gone, woven into shadow that appeared to have all but dissolved into an outer darkness, which he was then sent alone. His body was gone for who knows how long, if there was a finite duration of time that one could be here. With his body gone, only he remained. And who was Sombra? He had always been he was always better than what he was expected to be, even in this otherworldly place that would not change. Sombra was a demon unknown to all but one mortal soul, the soul of a child that had created him with a gamble, anger, and dark magic that had judged such a dim pony worthy of corruption. The results of that corruption was Sombra himself, a defiant, reclusive sort who believed in the power of the mind and all the glorious insanity and genius that his had. Something he wanted to use in order to walk the world to find its farthest reaches, where no pony plagued him with the misery their unwanted company brought. Instead, the twisted desire of a crystal pony cult, bent on unneeded vengeance and sadistic desire, had held him hostage as the worst kind of weapon, one that could feel and see his powers being abused and the blood that stained his hooves because of a lonely born broken child who had never been properly dealt with, one whose impulsivities and utter stupidity was only countered by young Sombra's cold calculations and fierce intellect. Those two had been exploited by a twisted mind who wanted only to abuse power, ponies, and most of all Sombra himself, the demon he had unknowingly summoned and unwillingly stolen a name from. And so begins the first year of the not entirely divided duo in the goddess-wrought void to house the two halves of the king. There is a maddening dysphoria in no longer having a body or world to take shape in for all who lack more than one form. Sombra had always known what it felt like to dissolve into shadow. It was better that way. The anger he felt now, a savage and all-consuming force that shaped what senses still worked and etched every memory with the deadliest precision, so nothing would be forgotten for a long while. Later, he would ensure that nothing would escape his memory, even if he wanted it to. But for now, rage shook a realm with no boundary. He was alive at least, and alone, something that had always been a desire of his, an impossibility, while the crown and another's dark wishes had dedicated his life as much as the clinking of chains had governed the existence of crystal ponies. Now all of those things were gone, something that he would appreciate in time when rage subsided and the silence after the storm tempered with his nature, and his ambitions were softened for much needed self-examination. But there would be plenty of time for that. In time, there would be plenty of time for anything for some pony like him, who had known only limitations and bitterness. That would wait a long while. For 100 years, there would be nothing but the most beautiful fury unleashed in a place where nothing could appear, and time wore on in the darkness, and his very mind traveled forward with it, a world he could no longer see continuing to be outside the void, where only the cold of ice seeped in and chilled him. Something far colder than the ice would try to seep into his very mind and break it. Instead, he broke this otherworldly chill, defying it as he had defied everything else he had ever known. When the horror of his fiercest and longest bout of temper and anger that was indescribable and almost eldritch in its near infinite intensity was about to be shaped into something else, his mind snapped to the task. For nothing but the magic he was left in this God-sealed prison, made just for him, he wielded both his genius and his rage until his ambition-driven magic had forged the only thing he would need to remember: everything. Out of everything to focus on, one face was clearer than anything else. It was the face of a blue-coated goddess. She had beaten him and brought everything down with a single move. It was she he wanted nothing to do with. She was the younger one, the shadow of her sister, and the other princess. Nothing she should do mattered. And then she had done something that did. He hated her for it and despised her with every fiber of his being. Luna, he would never forget the name of his greatest enemy, had somehow sneaked past his notice. How? He had seen her before him in their fight, she who always seemed to look away and never spoke. She was weak, unremarkable, submissive, stupid, utterly useless, utterly worthless. This mare would never amount to anything and was a waste of the power she was born with. The mere thought of her ignited the feeling of fire through his mind. She couldn't escape his focus any longer. After all, she was what had been overlooked, so now she would become his focus. Everything else was just another card to gamble away, as dull and predictable as possible. It didn't matter what these factors and mortal identities did. They could be beaten and broken. But she was different. A challenge disguised as a complaint immortal. He couldn't account for her actions, and to say that troubled him would be the second greatest understatement in history. Sombra for now. There was no tidal force in front of his name. That was now returned to him. Would devote all mental energy not spent operating ethereal switches and functions to keep his memories of the past, present, and future intact on figuring out the perfect demise for Luna. While with enough time, which was near limitless here, he would be able to engineer the perfect torment for an immortal goddess and humiliate her with the burden of her own defeat. There would be nothing that could prevent him from this. No pony was present to challenge him. The time he would spend here was bound to exceed that of any mortal equine's life, and day and night cycle to hinder him. That same burning intent that was almost identical to his hatred for the twisted crystal pony cult that had brought him into this world would only urge him onward. So began the first 100 years of unrelenting anger that outlasted any mortal fire as the cold wore on. As always, Sombra endured. No matter how weak or capable one's enemies could be, Sombra treated each of his foes as just another face, for that was what they were until they made themselves stand apart as they acted upon the urge to make some futile attempt against him. All attempts had been futile until she made hers. The world was his enemy, and Sombra had always known this. From the moment he had been created, the young demon knew that his nature alone, regardless of his deeds and too different mind, would earn him foes that reached numbers few would bother to count. Know your enemy. It was only then that moves could be made against them, and the table they were so foolish to rest their hopes upon turned right under their muzzles. Then every measure taken against them, so nothing but hope remained within their grasp, and that too could break. He had seen it. He had felt it. Now here he was, having to know an enemy that could be fought, with all the time to keep his mind intact and only improve himself in this situation. How could a goddess be so foolish to ensure her actions would risk something like this? If there was one thing unknown to Sombra, it was the unattainable satisfaction of true revenge, a deprivation he despised so. Yet, if they were to meet again, he could exact all the vengeance he wanted against the deathless, cowering goddess. He told himself he would finally get a pony that had thought she could get away with hurting him. Luna was the most weak, unintelligent, compliant, submissive, and obnoxious creature that he had ever encountered, and he hated her. But to create the best way to torment her in order to push her past the breaking point till no pony could repair her, Sombra had to know Luna. The only way to do that would be to examine every memory he had of her, hundreds of times over, and deconstructing every facet of her behavior to map out the way she thought so she could be outsmarted. For 100 years, Luna would be his insane obsession. There were lifetimes of information for some pony like Sombra, whose hyper-vigilant mind examined the goddess princess, former apprentice Selene, and shadow of the sun in her forms. She was a warrior, her skill and weaponry subdued and hidden to those who didn't scrutinize her every move before realizing one of them would be their last. Under her blue forelock, her wide eyes that hid all the wonder she clung to with a desperation to survive, and that seemed so savagely mortal and familiar in the latent desire to transcend her situation. He observed a perception that could be caught in fleeting, sideways glances that appeared to predict just when those that surrounded her and falsely named her appear, would look away and catch only the smallest pieces of her unwavering, solemn gaze. With that eye for detail that allowed her to notice the smallest things and hear 100 words unsaid in every silence, she could make her supposedly meek demeanor appear completely honest and without effort. Her honesty was another thing that struck him as odd. How she protested, sometimes silently, how she could never seem to fit in her to tell, how she could never find it in her to tell the smallest fib at the risk of an unnatural silence. She was unnatural. How had he missed such chilling skills of observation? Each hit in battle she landed was carefully calculated, but equally furious in delivery. Her power, in fragments he recalled the flurry of power that only a demon like him could sense, and how it had clung to her, fitting her like a tailored cloak and matching her every movement and swirling with each bout of strong emotion that overtook her in their battle, invigorating her. He had thought that the power that she had been born into and twisted and fostered into something so befitting of her nature was wasted, though she was by far the most powerful creature he had met. And that sense of power and every ounce of hidden measured strength wasn't abused or squandered in order to exaggerate her nature and highlight her as a goddess. For somebody who lacked the maliciousness and cruel cunning that Sombra had, she was remarkably good at accepting her feared power and dominating the magic that she radiated, so her actions spoke. And this element that made her so unapproachable, this threatening alien aspect of her, had piqued his interest. It would make her all the more interesting to fight, knowing she was more capable than she appeared. Sombra found this quality to her addicting? No, that wasn't right. Luna, his enemy, had an odd allure to her and well-harnessed power with the intelligence to manage it. That feature alone was worth immense amounts of focus. Sombra never thought to deny how magnetic it was. A proper rival had certainly been something he hadn't expected. Nor had he expected this horribly clever mare's look to speak for her when she opted for silence upon reevaluation. There was something so obvious about the way she had looked at him in battle. Those direct, vaguely bewildered looks in her wonder-struck eyes. They had never met before, though she lingered in many ways of Onyx's memories. Sombra had never given her much thought other than to acknowledge that she was one of the last alicorns. And she looked at him with an unmistakable recognition mixed with fear that haunted him. It was heart-wrenching. The void stirred at this with Sombra's discontent over the choice. It wasn't a proper term to describe his enemy, but it was what he thought best fit. Some pony sympathetic to Luna would find the look she gave him, how troubled she was with every lasting moment that they had looked at each other, to be heart-wrenching. Any mention of a heart caused further disturbances in Sombra's presence as he recalled her winning move, the kiss that had confused him so much in its aftermath. Every time he recalled the event, it was with the sourness at knowing she was his enemy and how disgusted he was that some pony he dreaded had gotten that close to him with a mere twist. Well, he did admit she was clever at the very least. And though his hatred for her burned on, even brighter the longer he obsessed over this mare, the knowledge that she was intelligent enough to stand against him, or just intelligent in general really, was pleasing, and Sombra would know what pleasing felt like. Every action of retaliation against the mind that tried to bind his fate had been pleasing, but with a more vicious feel to it. This was like a pause, a single moment of contentment, before his tempest of vindictive desire resumed and browsed each instance of Luna all over again. Luna was a typical target of many of Onyx's cruelties, and in his life, the young cult had pursued her and stalked, for there was no intelligence in his desire to seek Luna out. The mare, when she was far younger in her forays into the dense wooden area surrounded the tower Starsworld lived in. For a century, so eye-catching and out of place in the crystalline castles and cobblestone towers, she didn't look completely hideous in that forest as Sombra would have thought of any other pony. And it was moments like this where Luna was free of woe and distress, and her many anxieties that troubled her in every memory, both Onyx's and Sombra's, that Sombra liked to observe her most. He found her most curious when she wasn't alarmed or trying to hide how extreme her emotions were, that he could stop and watch Luna when she wasn't falling apart. He never asked himself why. His focus always resumed soon enough, but once or twice he found himself thinking about how her mane looked like the night sky when he met Luna for the first and only time. It was an obvious comparison to make, but he liked it. Anything to remind him of the sight of the stars. The only thing he missed was always appreciated. The longer he fixated on her, the more his focus steered elsewhere. Though he studied the memories of Luna meticulously, he continued to assert she was his enemy, a statement he never doubted, before he stopped making such useless reminders altogether and became even more absorbed in studying what visions of Luna he had constantly, since there was little to distract him. Small antics of hers never ceased to spark some feeling of amusement in him. The way she tilted her head when pondering something, how she looked when her surroundings seemed to dissolve before her whenever she was engrossed in a book of verse, the coldest stare she had in battle, the way she communicated too much with so little noise. He had always had a twisted appreciation for that in his eternal selfishness. Even if her loyalty to her sister was misplaced to him, it was plain that she was a creature who, despite all her devotion and hidden passions, wasn't as naturally inclined to such somberness as it seemed. Something was missing, and it didn't take long for Sombra to realize that he had never seen a memory where Luna smiled. What Sombra found to be the most troubling about Luna, he never called her anything else, was that she wasn't stupid or commonplace. Once he picked her out of a crowd or any other setting, it was impossible to forget the impression she made. No matter how much she tried to disappear or hide, she only stood out more and more to him, even in memories he had viewed thousands of times. She could see things that others never acknowledged. She saw him. She didn't see the king, and if she had, she saw past him. She saw Sombra, and no matter how strange they were to one another, she had always looked at Sombra like she had known him, like that had made it hurt so much to see him when they fought. Luna hadn't just suspected him of being somebody else. He had seen that too. But she was able to see Sombra himself, no matter how much he had tried to drown in the darkness and grudgingly accept that castle as his tomb, so as long as he died by his own terms. Everything about that was beautiful, but there was also something deeply horrifying too. The moment she kissed him felt like the invisible imaginary gears in the clockwork world that only they defied had clicked. The moment Sombra knew what everything he had put aside and all the reactions he overlooked amounted to, he thought that he could feel them click again, louder than before. As he looked over that memory yet again, he felt the surge of cold that only he was sure he could withstand as he thought about Luna, the mare with the brilliant mind he had to beat. Luna with the greatest power he had ever witnessed. Luna who he couldn't control. Even if he wanted to, he would feel something he hadn't felt before. Guilt. Luna, whom he felt sorry for ever hurting. She was like no pony else who held her own. She had done the impossible. She had proved him wrong. As 100 years ran out and the gears of the world clicked again, Sombra felt them whether they were his imagination or not. He felt a cold sense of dread and dawning realization that of what he had never imagined as everything fell into place within his mind. He did know his enemy, far better than he ever thought he would. Sombra knew that he loved her. And that knowledge felt like whiplash. One conclusion that he wanted to tear apart and desperately try to deny because he simply couldn't believe it. It hurt more than anything he had ever known right then and there, because he knew that it was right and all denial would fall apart before he could ever even work on establishing anything that might counter this. Whatever this was, this feeling so like hatred except for its core, was the strangest thing he ever felt. And he was scared, or maybe excited. He wasn't really sure. But maybe this wouldn't be as God's awful as he anticipated it would be. After all, this is why he couldn't conjure even half a plan to hurt this mare who was so beautiful when she stood alone. Then, such a feeling was indescribable, but he didn't want any pony to take this away from him, even if he let them, or there was some pony to try. All this felt like drawing out poison. There was so much he wanted to know. what her smile looked like, what she thought about anything and everything. If she had seen all the world, all the known world, if she would tell him about it, what their next meeting would be like. The list went on and on as soon as he embraced this strange, addictive, and, in its own way, rebellious nature. Bit by bit, he could take his mind back and begin to overturn some of what had been done to him with something other than just sheer stubbornness and cunning. There was something else fueling him now. He would have to wait to see Luna. That was an ache he would need to bear. But for them, it would be worth it. He had seen the ponies in the world. He had read about distant lands. But there was something unsatisfying about now that particular dream had been moved to second place, and a distant one at that. He was more selfish, arrogant, cunning, ruthless, thoughtful, ambitious, and more. Absolutely nothing would get in his way to see the world and, in the end, her. There would be all the consequences he could imagine, and even some he couldn't. He was Sombra, the best the world had ever known, and with the hope he never had before, he would seek Luna, the brightest. So the wait began. He remembered, he planned, he mourned, he burned with fury and everything else that he felt in droves, and he hoped that wherever Luna was, she remembered him too. And this was the closest thing to freedom Sombra had ever known, and as tragic as that was to any pony else, Sombra only found this experience to be riveting. He was the center of the world, alone, and not as restless as he had once been. While he certainly wasn't happy or even relieved, he felt relatively burdened and had accepted as much of the present and future here as possible, even if it dragged on. Time wasn't much of a bother to him. For once, Sombra's life wasn't agonizing. His mood wasn't nearly as volatile as it had once been. If he had cared to term it as anything, it would be safe. Like love, it was an entirely new experience. And even if he preferred the former, safe wasn't a horrid thing to be, though it could be jarring. Sometimes, after a few decades, meddling with magic systems and imagining anything that happened to cross his mind in a cold and unforgiving void of constant darkness, Sombra would be overtaken by long bouts of paranoia and hurriedly deconstructed his experiments, ethereal constructions gleaming when his presence neared them, vanishing faster than any mortal creature could blink as he waited for harm to come to him. On occasions like this, he would have to shake his worst memories and the sensations of searing hot magic tearing him apart. It was almost stunning when nothing hurt him, and he could go back to rebuilding everything better than before, the only thing close to the sound being memories of others and his own tone twisted for his equine voice into the rumbling of his shadow form. Even if he lacked that much substance here, Sombra was never bored. He had never been one to get lonely either, but there was some things he missed, and not being able to control these things angered him. He was not free from episodes of frustration that had developed into anger. Like love, he embraced almost any emotion he felt. Oftentimes, he just longed to hear his own voice again, or flip his mane the way that made onyx seethe. Seeing colors again would be something he looked forward to. He missed the sound of her voice, and sometimes he would be quieter than usual for months while he replayed the only instances of he talking where she wasn't scared or mournful. There wasn't a very many of those, but whenever Luna sounded sad, it hurt him more than he would ever let any pony know. If he didn't know already the answer, and he had some pony to ask, he would inquire to whether any pony cared about her. Sombra certainly did. Sombra could withstand each passing year with increasing ease after his epiphany. As expected, he slipped in and out of periods of mania, depression, and other things he wouldn't dare name. Mostly it was the lower moods. They were the most familiar after all. He knew that this was far better than the alternative. Had he been anywhere close to sane, his mind would have unraveled before him until only distorted instincts remained. It had been centuries since he had ended up here, and he had fully embraced his feelings for Luna. His obsession had worn down to something else that wasn't as manic in nature. Something that felt much more thoughtful if he could describe it to any pony that had been there. If he could divide how he spent his time into two absolutes, it would be a rather neat divide between craving further isolation as his obsession over future machinations and thinking about Luna. Since he had lacked any knowledge of what became of her after their one and only encounter, whenever he was at his lowest moods, he found himself coming back to it time and time again. He had already studied their confrontation tens of thousands of times. It was familiar, nostalgic, and no matter how many times he looked at the memory, he hadn't been able to figure out one thing. Why some pony as smart and well-versed in magic as Luna had failed to defeat him by exploiting the fact that he was, and still is, a mortal. In the aftermath of their kiss, she could have easily taken her blade to him, or forced him to help her locate her elder sister and have them both smite him. Sombra was the most powerful mortal they had ever encountered, and he was certain of that. But that didn't mean that Luna wasn't presented with more than enough opportunities, ones that she would have seen to end his life. So why didn't she? She wasn't incompetent as he had first thought, and was more likely to break rules and entice any form of rebellion than her sister, and she was more likely to fight unconventionally or even use dubious tactics. So why would he be here, where he was preserved instead of reduced to ash, and in snow after a much more prolonged siege? There were plenty of times That could have been the outcome, yet her actions acted as the focal point, where everything rippled out of control. Luna and her sister may not have been as skilled as they could have been for goddesses, but they were still that, goddesses. And they would not tire as easily as he would. She had seen him, however briefly, in all his unstable rants and sudden displays of temper, so how could she allow Sombra to have any chance of survival or any kind of preservation at all? Why would she not see that being sealed in a soul-chilling void where he couldn't physically age or be burdened with any physical needs at all was more of a mercy than a punishment? She had seen him. She could see past all of the regalia that had been forced upon him, and yet she couldn't calculate such an simple possibility. That was outrageous. He wanted her to look at him now. He loved her. He was smarter. His temper had gone from monstrously violent to something much more like an abnormally angry youth. He wasn't as violent any longer. He had time to think about everything, to be better. He was the center of the world. He could barely sense Onyx anymore. Sombra had long since deduced that he was suffering the same fate Sombra was enjoying so much, for he had braved the cold and so much more. When he got out, if he did at all, he was going to use the short amount of time he would have to live to tell her how sorry he was and that he loved her. Maybe they could see the world before the effects of being in here took their toll. He could see the future, and maybe he would get to see her smile. But he might not tell her at all. He knew that mare, and if she loved him back, then he knew she of all immortals wouldn't be able to handle his death unless he managed to avoid the clutches of Tartarus. He'd find the book again and give her any clue to what happened to the other gods. Maybe he'd get an answer as well. But none of this would be possible if it weren't for a mistake. Except maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. That thought, a second revelation, had more impact on him than falling down the entirety of the winding staircase he had made in the Crystal Empire. Of course, she couldn't have possibly known everything, but because of her, Luna had saved him. Luna, the mare he loved more than he loved himself, was his savior. Because of her, the only destiny he had was his own. Even though he would be bound to Onyx forever, the godly magic used to send them both here had weakened their ties ever so slightly. By the very stars that dared mimic her mane, his destiny was now his. If he had a destiny at all. And this changed everything. It was his and his alone, and he could make it as grand or as terrible as he wanted it to be. Any dream he ever had. Maybe, just maybe, it could be true now. Luna was the reason he was alive, and through his own guiles may have aided him in wavering this fate. May have aided him in weaving this fate. She was the one who had sealed it. For this, he loved her again. He now had freedom, or something like it. She was trapped when she last saw him, and if she was still trapped when he found her, then he would return the favor and set her free as well. To the best of his abilities, he'd help her find who she had been forgetting, who she needed herself, who she needed most, herself. Sombra didn't care if he could never be happy or truly free, because now he had a life to make his own and a fight to win. He would wait and fight on. He would defy as Luna defied all his expectations. He would plan, and he would continue to be always rebellious, no matter how big or small the challenges he faced would be. And for the first time in a long, long while, Sombra wanted to live again. Celestial coloring. Drabble minific. Her bobbed pink mane swished softly in the beams of sunlight and summer air pouring through the window far above her tiny white body, where even her young wings could not take her. She was barely old enough to flap them in mock flight, but she still fluttered them in agitation. Celestia's magenta eyes looked down at her drawing, a completely nonsensical and incomprehensible array of lines drawn in clumsy, thick crayons that had to be held by her toddler hooves, since her magic could only come in small spurts, all of which were too weak to accomplish anything. Maybe it was a castle. There was certainly a lot of gray in one large slab shape that might have been a foolish interpretation of her home in the everfree forest, which she had yet to ever see. The small filly had barely seen the gardens themselves, and that was because she had a habit of losing her shiny mane clips and crying when her mother and father couldn't find them. It wasn't her fault that she only liked to play in the flower beds instead of climb the big scary trees that her perfect picture couldn't have. She had colored what was definitely a sky in perfect pink, and the liberal use of that particular color to replicate her favorite hour, dawn, clearly demonstrated that it was her favorite. In front of the maybe castle, on surprisingly neat-looking grass, these shapes half stood and half floated on the ground. Celestia was never going to grow up with the ability to draw more than a basic oval petal flower, but at least she had put her heart into scratching out 3 alicorn shapes with crayons that she also liked to hold in her mouth when nobody was watching. Surely she accidentally gave her father, High King Noctis, a god who was loved and feared, 5 legs instead of 4. But she tried. And she may have drawn her own mane far too long. She wanted to grow it out. But her circle and stick picture self at least looked equine instead of eldritch. Lumina, prophetess and god queen of the realm, had never looked more ugly than in her daughter's drawings. Her tall legs were skyscraping stilts, though she was shorter than her husband. Her slender frame was completely marred and instead replaced with a large sphere for her body and head. A crude face, horns, wings, mane, and mark adorned it, and her swishing tail made burnt broom's bristles look lovely. Celestia thought the vision of her mother that she had so proudly put on the paper was very nice. Her mother was with foal, but Celestia didn't really know what that meant because she didn't see any other foals. That new brother or sister that she was promised hadn't appeared at all. Perhaps it was in revenge that Celestia decided to draw her mother like she was a blimp. Yet the world wouldn't know what evil schemes ran through her head as she grinned widely, admiring her work. Why? Because at the moment something landed on the paper that Celestia's feeble magic aura held. She dropped the portrait of her family, eyes wide, as though she had seen the end. Mama! Spider! And these have been selected chapters from Missing Pages and Scrawled Footnotes, written by Ice Star. Alright, every pony, yeah, I'm really sorry for all the mistakes I made during the reading. It wasn't my intention, honestly. I still do get nervous when doing readings for all of you. I am not too proud to admit that.
That's because you lack fine grace, unlike me. I didn't make any mistakes whatsoever.
I don't know what you might have been listening to, but in Click, you made a couple of mistakes. I mean, do we really have to go back and see what those are? Or will you be mature enough to admit that you also make mistakes, Lily?
I have no clue what you mean. I didn't make a single mistake at all. You must have been hearing things, darling. Has all that attention gone to your head?
Alright. Okay, every pony, it looks like Lily is a little too proud to admit when she's made a mistake. But I heard it and all of you heard it as well. She did make some mistakes. But for her sake and her fragile pride, we'll say that she didn't. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed this reading, and we look forward to doing readings like this again in the future. It was actually fun. For right now, I am Lotus Moon.
And I'm Lily.
And we want to wish you a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night wherever you are, every pony. Good night.
Sweet nightmares, every pony.